The dust of the valley tasted like failure, and Caleb knew the flavor well. It was in his water, in his food, and in the back of his throat every morning he woke up in the cramped, sun-bleached cabin that was the last remnant of his fallen empire. Once, his name had echoed across the territory, a name synonymous with sprawling herds and endless acres of green pasture. Now, his name was a ghost, a cautionary tale whispered by the same men who once clamored for his favor. He saw her for the first time by the dried-up town well, a small, wiry figure huddled in the scant shade of the gallows. The other children gave her a wide berth, their whispers as cruel as the biting prairie wind. They called her Dust Devil, for she was as silent and grimy as the earth itself. But Caleb saw something else. In her quiet, observant eyes, he saw not emptiness, but a deep, unnerving stillness, as if she were watching the world from a place no one else could reach. That evening, as the townsfolk jeered and shook their heads at the broke rancher taking in another stray, Caleb led the girl, Rose, back to his cabin. He knew it was madness. He could barely feed himself. But in the hollowed-out canyon of his soul, a place carved by betrayal and public shame, he felt a flicker of something he hadn't felt in years, a purpose. He didn't know then that he wasn't saving her, he was being handed the key to saving himself and the entire drought-stricken land. The first week was an exercise in silence. The girl, Rose, moved through his small, dilapidated cabin like a phantom, her feet making no sound on the rough-hewn floorboards. She ate the meager offerings of beans and hardtack without a word, her gaze fixed on something beyond the cabin walls. Caleb, for his part, was lost in his own cavern of memories, the ghosts of his past life a constant, tormenting presence. He saw his sprawling ranch house, heard the laughter of his men, felt the weight of the gold watch in his pocket, a watch long since sold for a bag of flour. He was a king dethroned, and this silent, watchful child was the sole subject in his kingdom of dust and regret. One afternoon, driven by a gnawing restlessness, he went to the leaning shed to sort through the rusted remnants of his former life. Tools lay scattered in chaotic piles, a testament to his own disordered mind. He spent an hour in the suffocating heat before giving up, defeated, and retreating to the shade of the porch. An hour later, he returned for a hammer and stopped dead in the doorway. The chaos was gone. The tools were arranged on the dirt floor in a breathtakingly intricate spiral. It wasn't just neat, it was a symphony of logic. Shovels were graded by size, hammers by weight, and every piece of rope was coiled to the exact same diameter. At the center of it all was a complex lattice of stray nuts and bolts, forming a pattern that made his breath catch. It was a gear system, a perfect, interlocking design for a water pump he had once spent a fortune trying and failing to engineer. He stared, his heart pounding. It couldn't be. He turned to look for Rose, who sat on the porch step, calmly tracing patterns in the dust with a stick, as if she hadn't just solved a puzzle that had broken a team of East Coast engineers. He dismissed it as a child's strange game, a coincidence. It was easier than believing in the impossible. The memory came to him in the dead of night, a storm of images that left him breathless and drenched in a cold sweat. He was younger, standing on the veranda of his grand ranch house, the world his oyster. The land stretched before him, a sea of green grass and fat cattle, a testament to his vision and relentless drive. Beside him stood Bartholomew Thorne, a man whose smile was as wide and welcoming as his ambitions were sharp and cruel. Thorne was his partner, his friend, the charismatic visionary who spoke of empires built on beef and railroads. Caleb, Thorne had said, his voice smooth as polished mahogany, we are on the cusp of controlling this entire territory. One more deal. The water rights to the Crimson River. It's risky, a massive investment, but with it, we become gods here. Caleb, blinded by his own pride and the intoxicating allure of absolute power, had agreed. He poured every last dollar of his fortune into the venture, signing papers Thorne pushed in front of him, trusting the bond they had forged over years of shared struggle. The betrayal was as swift as it was total. The documents were clever forgeries. The investments were a mirage, the money funneled into Thorne's private accounts. When the collapse came, the paper trail led directly, unequivocally, to Caleb. Thorne played the part of the heartbroken, duped partner, publicly lamenting the downfall of his friend while his lawyers moved like sharks in bloody water, seizing Caleb's assets to cover the losses. Caleb was ruined, his name blackened with accusations of fraud and incompetence. He lost his ranch, his herds, his friends, his honor. The system, a complex machine of laws and ledgers he had once commanded, had been turned against him by the one man he trusted. He was cast out, a pariah left with nothing but the bitter taste of Thorne's treachery. The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked, parched earth. The drought was tightening its grip on the valley, turning Caleb's small plot of land into a lifeless desert. His last few scrawny cattle hung their heads, their ribs a stark relief against their hides. Despair was a physical weight, pressing down on him, suffocating the last embers of his fighting spirit. He sat on his porch, a broken man staring at his broken land, when he noticed Rose. She was in the yard, not playing, but working with a fierce, silent concentration. Using a sharpened stick, she was carving an enormous, sprawling map into the hard-packed dirt. It wasn't a child's doodle, it was a masterpiece of topographical precision. He walked closer, his shadow falling across her work. He recognized the shapes of the mesas, the curve of the dry riverbed, the exact placement of the rock formations that dotted the valley. But she had drawn more. There were lines and symbols he didn't understand, intricate patterns that flowed beneath the surface of the land he thought he knew so well. It was a map of the unseen. It showed the deep geology of the valley, the secret veins of rock and subterranean aquifers hidden hundreds of feet below. His skepticism warred with a rising sense of awe. How could this child, who had never held a surveyor's tool or read a geology textbook, know the secrets buried in the heart of the earth? Rose stopped drawing. She looked up at him, her expression unreadable, and then pointed a small, dusty finger to a single, unremarkable spot on her map, a barren patch of alkali flats less than 100 yards from his cabin. Then she looked at the same spot on the real land and simply nodded. There. In that moment, Caleb's world tilted. The flicker of purpose he'd felt when he first saw her ignited into a blazing fire of conviction. This was no coincidence. This was a miracle. Caleb carefully transcribed the drawing from the dust onto a piece of old parchment, his hands trembling with a mixture of hope and fear. He knew there was only one person who would even entertain such a wild notion. Finn was a ghost, much like Caleb himself. A brilliant telegrapher and self-taught surveyor, Finn had been run out of the territorial capital by Thorne's growing network of influence after he'd uncovered discrepancies in Thorne's early land deeds. He now lived in a secluded shack overflowing with wires, batteries, and strange mechanical contraptions, communicating with the world through the staccato clicks of his telegraph key. When Caleb unrolled the parchment on Finn's cluttered workbench, the old surveyor scoffed. "Caleb, you've been out in the sun too long. This is the fantasy of a bored child," but as he studied it, his derision slowly melted away. He pulled out his own meticulously drafted charts and geological surveys of the valley. He cross-referenced, measured, calculated. The silence in the shack stretched, broken only by the rustle of paper and Finn's increasingly frequent grunts of astonishment. "My God," Finn whispered, his finger tracing one of the lines Rose had drawn. This formation, it would create a natural artesian pressure system. If there were an aquifer here, it would be immense. All my surveys suggested the water table was 1,000 feet deeper. But this changes the entire geological model. Convinced, Caleb took the map to Sheriff Miller, a man who lived and died by the book. Miller represented the system, impersonal, skeptical, and weary. He listened to Caleb's frantic explanation, his face a mask of bureaucratic pity. "Caleb," he said, pushing the parchment back across his desk. "I know you've had a hard time. But I can't issue drilling permits based on a drawing. You have no geological reports, no expert testimony. You're a disgraced man bringing me a fantasy from an orphan girl. My hands are tied." The system that Thorne had used to destroy him was now the wall that stood between him and salvation. News in the territory traveled on the wind, and the wind always seemed to blow towards Bartholomew Thorne. He sat in Caleb's old office, in Caleb's old chair, a glass of expensive whiskey in his hand. The reports from town were amusing at first. His old, broken-down rival, Caleb was apparently digging for water on a worthless patch of alkali flats, guided by the scribbles of a mute street urchin. It was pathetic. But a sliver of unease pricked at Thorn's satisfaction. He remembered Caleb's uncanny intuition, his almost supernatural ability to read the land. Caleb wasn't a fool, and desperation could be a powerful catalyst for genius. Deciding to put the matter to rest, and to savor one last taste of victory, Thorn rode out to Caleb's hovel. He found Caleb and the girl near a patch of disturbed earth, a crude hand-dug hole marking their efforts. "Caleb," Thorn said, his voice dripping with false sympathy as he dismounted. "I heard you were prospecting. I'll make you a final offer for this miserable patch of dirt. $100. More than it's worth, but consider it an act of charity." As he spoke, his eyes fell upon Rose, who watched him with her unnervingly still gaze. He saw the intricate patterns she was tracing in the dust nearby. And then he saw it. It wasn't just a map of the land. It was a map of resources. A map of power. He didn't understand how, but he knew with chilling certainty that this child was not a stray, but a key. A resource to be acquired and exploited. His mind raced, calculating the immense value of a person who could see through the earth. The girl was a living gold mine. His offer of charity vanished, replaced by the cold, hard glint of acquisition. The stakes had just changed entirely. He was no longer there to gloat over Caleb, he was there to claim his next, and most valuable, asset. The moment Thorn left, the air crackled with a new, dangerous urgency. Caleb saw the predatory gleam in Thorn's eyes, the way he had looked at Rose not as a child, but as a prize. "He knows," Caleb said to Finn, his voice low and grim as they stood over the half-dug well that night. "He doesn't know how, but he knows she's the key." Finn nodded, his face illuminated by the flickering lantern light. "His telegraphs have been busy. He's petitioning the circuit judge, citing your bankruptcy and an old territorial domain clause. He's trying to get an emergency seizure order on your land. He's also filed a petition with the county for custody of Rose, claiming she's an endangered ward in the care of an unstable pauper." The trap was closing. Thorn was using the law as his weapon once again, twisting it to serve his greed. They had days, maybe only hours. A frantic energy seized them. The slow, methodical work became a desperate race against the clock. Caleb dug with a fury he hadn't felt in years, his muscles screaming in protest. The blisters on his hands tore open, but he didn't stop. Finn, using his knowledge of levers and engineering, rigged a crude but effective pulley system to haul the buckets of rock and dirt. Every swing of the pickaxe was a blow against Thorn. Every bucket of earth was a second stolen back from the encroaching deadline. Rose watched them, her small form a silhouette against the vast, star-dusted sky. She wasn't just the source of their hope, she was its purpose. Caleb was no longer digging to reclaim his name or his land. He was digging to protect her. He was building a wall of earth and sweat and sheer wool between this innocent, brilliant child and the soulless monster who sought to own her. The rhythmic thud of the pickaxe was the frantic heartbeat of their rebellion. The sky was just beginning to bleed with the bruised purple of dawn when the sound of approaching horses shattered the rhythm of their work. Thorn arrived, flanked by two of his hired men and, to Caleb's sinking horror, Sheriff Miller, who held a roll of official paper in his hand. "It's over, Caleb," Thorn announced, his voice booming with triumph. "The judge has granted my order. This land is now under my conservatorship pending auction." "You're trespassing." Sheriff Miller stepped forward, his face etched with regret but his voice firm. "Caleb, I have to ask you to lay down your tools and vacate the property." As Thorn's men moved to grab the digging equipment, Thorn himself walked towards Rose, a sickeningly paternal smile on his face. "And I have an order from the county granting me temporary guardianship of the child. She'll be well cared for." This was the end. The system had won. Caleb felt the last of his strength drain away, replaced by a cold, hollow despair. He had failed. Just as Thorn reached for Rose's arm, she finally spoke. Her voice was not the timid whisper of a child, but clear and resonant, cutting through the morning air like a shard of glass. She did not look at Caleb. She looked directly at Thorn. "Ledger B, page 47, she said, her voice devoid of emotion. The payment from the Crimson Syndicate. You hid it there. Thorn froze, the color draining from his face. The smile evaporated, replaced by a mask of pure shock and terror. No one could have known that detail. It was the linchpin of his entire fraud, a secret buried so deep he had almost forgotten it himself. He had committed the forgeries in a secluded office, years ago, witnessed by no one. Except, he now realized with a dawning, soul-crushing horror, he had been wrong. Sheriff Miller stared, bewildered by the exchange. The girl's cryptic words meant nothing to him, but Thorn's reaction was a confession in itself. The powerful rancher, who commanded judges and bent the law to his will, was staring at a small girl as if he had just seen a ghost. The air was thick with unspoken history, with the sudden, violent unraveling of a carefully constructed lie. At that exact, tension-filled moment, a low rumble began deep within the earth. The ground beneath their feet trembled. Before anyone could react, the bottom of the well gave way with a deafening roar, and a powerful column of crystal-clear water erupted into the sky, a geyser of impossible life shooting 50 feet into the air. It rained down on them all, on Caleb's exhausted, triumphant face, on Thorn's terrified, guilty one, on the sheriff's stunned expression. The water was real. The miracle was real. It washed the dust from their faces and, in an instant, washed away all doubt. This was not a madman's fantasy, it was the truth, unearthed by a forgotten girl and a man who refused to give up. The sight of the water, a tangible symbol of renewal and proof of Rose's impossible gift, was the final piece of the puzzle for Sheriff Miller. He looked from the gushing well to Thorn's panicked eyes, and then back to Rose, who stood calmly amidst the chaos. The lawman's duty, so long clouded by procedure and Thorn's influence, was suddenly crystal clear. Bartholomew Thorn, Miller said, his voice ringing with newfound authority as he drew his pistol. I'm placing you under arrest on suspicion of fraud. We're going to have a look at your books. Starting with Ledger B, Thorn's empire, built on a foundation of lies, began to dissolve in the life-giving water he had tried to suppress. Caleb, standing drenched and victorious, wasn't just a rancher who'd found water. He was a protector who had saved his charge, a fallen man who had finally, truly, reclaimed his honor. The water changed everything. It flowed from Caleb's land out into the valley, breathing life back into the parched homesteads that had suffered under Thorn's monopolistic control. Small-time ranchers and farmers, once on the brink of ruin, found their fields turning green again. Thorn's arrest led to a full-scale investigation that unraveled his entire web of corruption, his empire collapsing like a house of cards. Caleb's name was cleared, his honor restored in the eyes of the very people who had once scorned him. He was offered his old life back, the chance to rebuild his fortune, but he refused. He had discovered a different kind of wealth. His home was no longer a vast, empty mansion, but a small, sturdy cabin filled with the quiet hum of a real family. He and Rose worked side by side, not as a broken man and a silent ward, but as partners. She would show him the hidden patterns of the land, where the soil was richest, where the wind blew gentlest, and he would translate her silent genius into a thriving, sustainable future for their entire community. She spoke more now, not in long sentences, but in profound, insightful observations that continued to astonish him. He learned that her family had been surveyors, early victims of Thorn's land grabs, and she had watched him, learning his secrets from the shadows before she was left all alone. She wasn't just a genius, she was a survivor. They were a strange but perfect pair, the fallen protector who had found his purpose, and the hidden genius who had finally found her voice and her home. And so, we see that the most valuable treasures are often hidden in the places we are told not to look. The world will always rush to judge, to label, and to discard what it doesn't immediately understand. But true vision lies in seeing the worth that others miss. It's about having the courage to believe in a pattern in the dust, and the heart to protect the one who draws it. Thank you for watching all the way to the end. If this story of redemption and hidden genius resonated with you, please leave a comment telling us what you think, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications for more stories that inspire.